This week's show where Beethoven got some of his best tunes. Hello, did Beethoven pinch some of his best tunes, and if so, where from? According to the conductor John Eliot Gardiner, Beethoven's symphonies are riddled with references to liberty and revolt taken from propaganda songs from the bloodiest years of the French Revolution. Gardner's formed his own orchestra, the Orchestre Revolutionnaire et Romantique, to play the music of Beethoven and Berlioz the way he thinks it ought to be played, on authentic instruments of the composer's time, recreating the sounds that the composer heard. He's ruffled feathers in the musical world, but his performances regularly receive critical and public acclaim as the most exciting in the business. We've asked John Eliot Gardiner to explore the two key strands of his orchestra's title, Revolution and Romance. In part two, we follow him rehearsing his new recording of Berlioz's most romantic work, Romeo and Juliet. But first, we go on a detective story, uncovering the tunes that Beethoven borrowed from the French Revolution.
Excuse me. Can we just do it? Can we just do slow motion, just so that everybody's clear? Just slow motion at the very beginning. Just slow motion. Here we go. And do 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 do. Yeah. And now I give you a new downbeat here. You come off on the upbeat here, and one. Two. Okay. Right. Let's do it up to speed again, please. Okay. Do 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 do. Do 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 do. Well, it'd be difficult to find anything more classical than the beginning of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. And you'd think that was typically German. Well, perhaps it isn't. Perhaps there's something French about it. And that's why we've come to this remote corner of southeast France in the Dauphiné to try and look for the roots of this music. Wordsworth, when he was in Paris during the French Revolution, he referred to wild blasts of music that did find their way into the midst of terrible events. We're trying to find a way of reconstructing the atmosphere that must have been around in the late 1790s during the French Revolution, and how people sang, ordinary people, perhaps under orders as to how to celebrate Napoleon's latest victories here.
This song was written at the height of the French Revolution as propaganda by the same man who wrote the Marseillaise, the French national anthem. Almost certainly it's the first time it's been sung for nearly 200 years. I'm convinced that Beethoven knew this and other songs by forgotten composers of the French Revolution, like Lefebvre and Gossec, and that he used their tunes to incorporate ideas of liberty and revolution into his symphonies. All these references have been forgotten until now. And as a result, perhaps we've been undervaluing and even misunderstanding some of the best-known symphonic music there is.
The influence of these fairly minor composers, all of whom were writing politically motivated music in France in the 1780s and 1790s, is not confined just to the Fifth Symphony of Beethoven. You can hear it in traces of the First Symphony, in the Sixth Symphony, the Pastoral, in the Ninth Symphony, and in the Seventh Symphony. In the Seventh Symphony, that very strongly dotted rhythm that one hears in the last movement, seems to come from Gossec's Hymn to the Republic. Very similar passage. was preparing the Fifth Symphony for recording 4 or 5 years ago, or for the first performances that led up to that recording, I came across a passage in an article written by a German musicologist in the 1920s, where he drew on this example of what the French called élan terrible, which is kind of the incitement to military action, characteristic of French music, which was used in the revolutionary period for political and military ends, and the éclat triomphal, in other words, the shout of joy and of victory at the end. And both those things are obviously apparent and audible in Beethoven's Fifth Symphony.
The famous opening notes of the Fifth Symphony are based on a piece of music written in 1794 and named after the revolutionary temple, the Panthéon in Paris. I've sent the music ahead to the amateur village choir at La Côte Saint-André. It's directed by the local tax inspector, Monsieur Chambray.
Mesdames, Messieurs, bonsoir.
I'm going to see whether they can sing it with the same revolutionary fervour that their ancestors must have brought to it.
Je ne crois pas. Non. Quand vous dites pour mourir, de mourir pour la République, je ne crois pas du tout. Pour mourir de la République, gna 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 gna. Pas du tout. Asseyez-vous. Vous êtes monarchiste, vous? Monarchiste? Ah bon?
Many of these songs were composed for great outdoor festivals, the political rallies of their time. The sleuth who's rediscovered them and copied out the scores for us is the musicologist David Charlton.
What happens was, first of all, the people started to gather on occasion, spontaneously. For example, around the time of the fall of the Bastille.
Is that when they sang Ça ira,
There were
ça ira?
musicians there already in 1789, and there were the people who were later going to form the core of the Conservatoire were already there at the fall of the Bastille.
Right.
There was a grand festival on the Champ de Mars, near where the Eiffel Tower now stands. Then the political events gradually changed, and the festivals carried on changing with them. And it became a kind of, first of all, semi-official, and then an official means of educating the public on a large scale. Not only did they print the text for these ceremonies, and these texts were sent all over France, because it was from Paris out into the regions. All France was to be unified under the revolution, and everybody, even in places such as La Côte Saint-André, were urged, even ordered, to have their own civic festivals at specific times of the year.
Et hop!
Nous jouerons tous.
Et
Le fer en main.
oui!
Nous jouerons tous.
Vous êtes formidable, madame. Quelle est votre profession? Allez, figurez le premier mouvement, vous connaissez sûrement. C'est ça qui était derrière dans la pensée de Berlioz, de Beethoven, quand il a écrit sa symphonie en ut mineur. Nous irons tous, le fer en main, de mourir pour la République. C'est magnifique, non?
The Revolution festivals went on for 10 years, and each of them had new music, and the music was of different types, either simple, one-line music, or it could be very complicated music, like, for example, Cherubini's Hymne du Panthéon, which was written in 94, for performance indoors, not outdoors like most of the public festivals, but for a particular interment, a particular ceremony, so Cherubini could afford to be more complex.
Nous jouerons tous. Nous jouerons tous. Le fer en main. Le fer en main. Nous jouerons tous. Nous jouerons tous. Nous jouerons tous. Nous jouerons tous. De mourir pour la République. De mourir pour la République. Et pour les droits des gens humains. Pour les droits du genre humain.
fantastic. I mean, absolutely blatant, flagrant pinching for Fifth Symphony. Nous jouerons tous le fer en main.
I think there's a real sense in which the terms révolutionnaire et romantique come together for the first time, really, in the history of music, in the music of Beethoven, in the sense that he is expressing and reflecting the political and social values and the environment of his day in a way that struck him so forcibly, and in a way that composers of the previous generation wouldn't have thought of articulating in musical terms. I mean, you can't imagine Mozart or Haydn trying to imbue their symphonies or their operas with a political message. The symphony that's traditionally regarded as the hallmark of Beethoven's own private struggle against destiny, against fate, and his triumph over the odds is the Fifth Symphony, fate hammering on the door. Well, is it really about that? It seems to me that it has very little to do with that. It's to do much more with Beethoven's own political affiliations.
I made about 15 mistakes and said it to a few other people as well, but mea culpa.
Beethoven, clearly taking the lead from Cherubini's setting, uses that little fragmentary figure, yapapapam, as an alarm call, as an incitement, as part of Élan Terrible, as the call to arms. And because of his incredibly refined sense of structure and his control of the architecture of the piece, the entire first movement is based on a repetition and a distribution of that theme across the different instruments of the orchestra. And it becomes a kind of hypnotic force in itself. In 1990, I started up an orchestra called the Orchestre Revolutionnaire et Romantique. It's rather a fancy title for what amounts to a freelance British London-based orchestra, though it has a lot of foreigners in it. But the underlying theme of the orchestra and its aim is to bring together the two strands of revolutionary fervour and romantic expression together in one body of musicians, and to re-look at the whole corpus of instrumental and particularly symphonic music that was growing up in Germany, on both sides of the Rhine, Germany and France, at the end of the 18th century and the first 30, 40 years of the 19th century. Now, every age in music, as the French critic Fétis said, is a revolutionary age, but none more so than this particular era, because it's the era of tremendous political events occurring in France, and the way that movement translated itself in musical terms, that it impinged so personally on the lives of a composer like Beethoven, and the political events of his day later on a composer such as Berlioz. And between them, the two of them achieved this extraordinary breakthrough in the expressive range and powers of the orchestra, what we now call the modern orchestra. But the trick of it is that the instruments that they were using and the whole sound world that emanated from these two composers is so radically different from the sounds that we're used to hearing in the concert hall nowadays.
Michael, wo ist dein F, bitteschön? Kannst du F blasen?
When you hear Beethoven symphonies performed by one of the great modern symphony orchestras today, there isn't the edge, there isn't that frisson of excitement that you get when you hear these démodé instruments. That's why it seems to me so bogus and so misleading to perform the music of Beethoven on instruments that were evolving in Germany in the second half of the 19th century. It just doesn't have the same timbre, it doesn't have the same expressive range, it doesn't have, above all, the colour that is so associated with these typically French instruments.
But don't forget also that the French wind instruments, not just woodwind, but also brass, you mentioned the horns, needed reinforcement for a performance in the open air. And so what did they do? The French Revolution invented its own musical instruments. And if you look at the engravings of the time, you can see there are two completely strange-looking instruments that are being blown. One of them, a great long curly thing, and another a straight thing. What are they? They are Roman, neoclassical Roman instruments that have been recreated and actually written into the music. What they wanted was something that was simple and could sound out of doors and sound primitive and strong at the same time.
There is a drive behind performers like John Eliot Gardiner, which says that there's still an awful lot we can learn about this music by trying to play it on the instruments of the composer's own day and trying to find out as much as we can about what they expected in terms of phrasing and articulation. And certainly for me, it has been an experience like seeing a picture with the dirt cleaned off it sometimes. There have been passages, for instance, in the scores of Beethoven symphonies, which have been an enigma to me. Why this? Why that? How do you do this? Things which modern orchestras are used to doing, but which they still find very difficult. And suddenly you try it out, for instance, on a horn of Beethoven's day, and the only way to get a certain note is to shove your hand higher up inside the bell, so that it makes a kind of muffled, kind of nasal sound. And suddenly an effect on the page makes sense.
The moment that you go back to the sound world of Beethoven, albeit one that was already out of date when he started composing for it, but one that he then distorted and pushed to its maximum degree of technical fluency and expressive range, you come into contact with something which is much more visceral and much more personally expressive, because there is no mush attached to it. It's far more clearly stranded, and the textures are far more clearly separated one from another, and that is a huge advantage with these period instruments.
The fortepiano is in an odd place, Leslie.
What Gardner has done is to look for possible meanings in phrases that are paralleled in words, catchphrases of the time. I don't know whether that's right or that's wrong, but I think it does get the performer to concentrate his or her mind wonderfully and to discover a new expressive, a new kind of meaningful intonation in that phrase, which again is something which does tend to get lacking in a lot of modern performance.
Right, are you ready? Shh. Are we rolling?
Well, when I first came across this Hymn to Agriculture by Lefebvre, I thought, what on earth can this possibly be? Here is the same sort of orchestration that Beethoven himself uses, the same theme, a type of rather innocent, ambling, pastoral mood that suits perfectly a hymn to agriculture, just as it does to the feeling of euphoria having gone through the countryside that Beethoven tries to bring after the storm in the last movement of his symphony. And the parallel is too close to be just simply random or circumstantial. as Beethoven went progressively deafer, he was able to give fuller rein to his adventurous and kind of pioneering spirit, which was one of pushing people to the extremes rather than going back to the very sort of contained classical education with which he'd started composing.
It's the complete opposite, if you like, to music of the Revolution, which is meant to be performed by ordinary people in ordinary circumstances. Beethoven, as it were, stands at the opposite end of that particular spectrum.
I mean, maybe he needed this sort of kick-start in order to create the symphonies that we know and cherish.
Beethoven wouldn't have written the same music had it not been for the French Revolution, any more than Blake would have written the same poetry.
What I find fascinating about the last two movements of the Fifth Symphony is that they're based on, or at least their origin, the seed, is a French seed from two separate composers. If you listen to the scherzo, the pizzicato in the strings and with a bassoon, it seems to have a direct derivation in Mayhew's G minor symphony, where he wrote for pizzicato strings, roughly contemporary with the Fifth Symphony, perhaps a little bit before. Now, Mayhew wrote a scherzo for pizzicato strings. Now, that's very unusual. Nobody had done that before. Beethoven is doing exactly the same thing, more or less at the same time. Had he heard Mayhew's symphony? Had he seen it? We don't know, but there it is. Now, when it comes to the explosion of the entrance of the full brass and that enormous dynamic range that you suddenly hear at the beginning of the last movement, coming out of this very, very quiet murmuring sound, you're right into the world of victory celebrations and the French cries of victoire and la liberté and all those things. And woven into that texture, one can hear the words la liberté, which imbues the whole second half of that movement with so much feeling of excitement and of awe.
La liberté, la liberté.
wrote the Marseillaise overnight, didn't he, in 1792?
He's the most famous.
And he wrote this thing, the Chantons la Liberté, this hymn that Beethoven seems to have picked up on in the last movement of the Fifth Symphony.
And these contain these little melodic germs that everybody immediately associates with liberty and revolution. La liberté, la liberté. So at Rouge et Lille, he comes in, he writes a fairly simple single-line kind of music that is for mass performance.
Yeah.
Ordinary people can learn it quickly, and we're taught it quickly.
Chantons la liberté, couronnons sa statue, comme un nouveau titan. Le crime est foudroyé. Relève, relève la tête abattue. Aux France et France, Dieu lui-même émerveillé. Aux France et Dieu lui-même émerveillé.
Chantons la liberté, couronnons sa statue, comme un nouveau titan. Le crime est foudroyé. Relève, relève ta tête abattue. Ô France, à tes destins, Dieu lui-même a veillé. Ô France, à tes destins, Dieu lui-même a veillé.
Chantons la liberté, couronnons sa statue, comme un nouveau titan. Le crime est foudroyé. Relève, relève ta tête abattue. Ô France, à tes destins, Dieu lui-même a veillé. Ô France, à tes destins, Dieu lui-même a
With Beethoven, more than any other composer, it seems to me that you're dealing with somebody who was there to shake the listener by the shoulders and to take the audience by the scruff of its neck, as it were. And he wasn't concerned with comfort and an emollient sound, something that soothes the senses. He wanted to arrest people's and to engage people's imaginations and a sense of urgency and danger in his music.
person in 10 uses their left hand. Some people have no fear of heights. Everyone can do things that the next person can't. Everyone finds beauty in a different kind of face. Everyone is different. That's why Bupa now offers you an individual health fund, which can help you pay for a wide range of Bupa healthcare services. You're amazing. We want you to stay that way.
From taxis to takeaways, one free call finds them all. Free pages 0500 192 192. You only have 3 days to apply for shares in Railtrack.
Sometimes the simplest way to get things done is to strip down to the bare essentials. It's a belief we share at Cheltenham and Gloucester. Because we're so streamlined, we're Britain's most cost-efficient mortgage lender. Mortgages from Cheltenham and Gloucester. We're run to make you richer.
It's the ultimate offer from the Sweet Centre. Pay absolutely nothing, not even a deposit, for 18 months until 1998. Take interest-free credit for 54 months until the year 2001. That's free credit until the year 2001, with absolutely nothing to pay until 1998 on all suites and settees. It's the Sweet Centre's ultimate offer, extended for a limited period. It cannot be missed.
Black & Decker have just made DIY a whole lot easier with the revolutionary cordless VersaPack system. The real breakthrough is that one set of rechargeable batteries powers the whole VersaPack range. So when you want extra tools, you save money because you don't need extra chargers and batteries. The new VersaPack system, guaranteed for 2 years, only from Black & Decker.
In 1794, in the heat of the French Revolution, the Paris Conservatoire was founded with an orchestra on revolutionary principles. It was here, not in Germany, that the symphonies of Beethoven were properly performed for the first time, 20 years after they'd been written. In the audience, and sometimes playing in the orchestra, was a young man from the French provinces, Hector Berlioz. He was fired with enthusiasm for Beethoven, and he was determined to try to build on his work. As one of the strands of the Orchestre Revolutionnaire Romantique is the revolutionary music of Beethoven, so the other is the romantic music of Berlioz.
I mean, the impression that Beethoven must have made on Berlioz was just colossal. I mean, he wrote in one of his letters, "Hearing that fearful giant Beethoven has shown me the point that the art of music has reached. It's a question of seizing it at that point and taking it further." And then he has a terrible moment of self-doubt or pretension, and he says, no, not further, that's impossible. He's reached the limits of the art, but equally far along another path. And of course, that's exactly what Berlioz did. I mean, he's taking Beethoven's example of using this newly transformed, transmogrified animal, the orchestra, the symphony orchestra, as it was evolving in the early years of the 19th century, and extending its expressive range and writing symphonies in a way that no other Frenchman had dared to do before him. This tiny little town, La Côte-Saint-André, influenced so radically the way he evolved as a musician. You can't divorce the two. His father was a doctor here, became mayor. He was much influenced by the sounds of the local band and the local folk songs that he'd heard, and by the poor choir of La Côte-Saint-André. It's unimaginable without that background. If one can accept the fact that the modern symphony orchestra irons out the ruggedness and tames the crude and raw spirit of a Beethoven, it also applies to Berlioz, because Berlioz exploits a range of expression and a range of timbre and colours even more vividly and even more extremely than does Beethoven. And the dangers are, in modern performances of Berlioz, is that his music tends to sound rather too cushy, rather too plush, and lacking in the kind of distinctive clarity and transparence, which is such a hallmark of him, as of all French composers, who always put a price on clarity of thought and clarity of instrumental diction, as it were.
Okay, can I just hear the 3 trombones and the 2 trumpets, please? Yeah.
What we're trying to do is to recreate the frisson, the tension that exists between the juxtaposition of the up-to-the-minute instrument and the old traditional instrument.
Can I just hear Peter and Phil, please, together? Peter. You need to be a bit higher, sorry.
Berlioz was using side-by-side instruments like the trumpet, which hadn't altered in essentials in its technology really for the last 2 or 3 centuries, cheek by jowl with the most modern state of the art when it came to the stringed instruments, because one has to remember that this is the great period of change in the nature of stringed instruments. And the fascinating thing about a piece like Romeo and Juliet, which is written on such a colossal scale, it's presented as a dramatic symphony, but it's theatrical in every respect and seems to aspire almost to the condition of opera from time to time, especially in its final scene, that it's also incredibly private and incredibly intimate. So that in the prologue, for instance, you have just a mezzo-soprano singing a cappella or accompanied by a single harp. And then suddenly the curtain goes up, as it were, and you're presented with the Capulet's Ball, where the whole panoply and range of the modern symphony orchestra, as Berlioz knew it, is brought into play, into action. And this is to describe not only the festivities, but what we perhaps know from a more recent example of the rumble at the gym in West Side Story, as of the rival factions of warring Capulets and Montagues. And Berlioz is really defiantly saying, this is the power of my orchestra. the next moment we're in the orchard outside Juliet's house, below her balcony, and Romeo musing to himself his feelings about Juliet and the impossibility of his love for her. And then Juliet's appearance on the balcony and her timid approach and the first very tentative exchanges of love and expression of love. And the fascinating thing about this is that Berlioz does it without any singers. The singers are woven into the texture of the orchestra, but nobody actually sings. Yes, you can hear Romeo's voice in the tenors of the orchestra, in the cellos and in the violas, and you can hear Juliet in the woodwind instruments, the cor anglais and the flute, and the oboe to some extent. But it's all written without the benefit of voices. And the compositional process that's invoked and used in that context is a fascination in itself, because it seems that what he may have done was to start by writing the voices, the words, in French of course, into the orchestral texture, as though singers were singing, as in an opera. And then he eliminated the actual voices themselves and just left the orchestra so that you've got, as it were, the essence of poetic diction and dramatic conversation and exchange in its distilled form. There doesn't seem any deprivation of a lack of singing when one listens to a purely orchestral piece like this. The essence of the thing is already there, and when the cellos play a recitative, as it were, which represents Romeo expressing his absolutely impossibly burning, ardent love for Juliet, which can never be consummated, it seems to have even greater poignancy by the fact that it doesn't have the distraction of the human voice. I find it very moving being in Berlioz's house, the house where he grew up in and where he received his education from his father, and knowing that this was the center of all his activities, apart from visiting Mélan, the place where he encountered the first love of his life when he was only 11, 12 years old. He was living an incredibly intense emotional life from earliest times, and it usually caused him desperate pain and anguish. There's one point when Berlioz says, "I've found only one way of completely satisfying this immense appetite for emotion, and that's music. Without it, certainly, I couldn't survive." It is music which gives way to itself, needing no words to make its expression specific. Its language then becomes quite indefinite, thanks to which it acquires still more power over beings endowed with imagination. One huge advantage of Berlioz over Beethoven is that he's still much less familiar than Beethoven, and the technical demands of his music are so great that there's never the likelihood of just routine performance. If, in addition to the technical difficulties, you can also convey a background to the music they're playing, I do think it enhances their ability to articulate that and therefore to make the entire experience from a listener's point of view even more intense.
Basses, go for it.
Oh, here.
Diminuendo tutti. Diminuendo tutti. Ah, and.
There's certain very technical and specific functions that a conductor has. He has to set, as it were, the emotional temperature of the piece. He has to indicate the kaleidoscopic changes of mood that so characterize the music of Berlioz. He has to indicate to what extent an instrumentalist has to really force his way through the texture, or to what extent he can sit back and just contain his sound. To what extent you have to struggle to articulate, and to what extent you can afford to be quite introspective in your instrumental discourse, as it were. But above all, he has to ignite the whole ensemble with a sense of urgency, and with a sense that the music that they're performing is music that is literally come from the composer's pen, that's fallen down onto the floor and has to be picked up from the factory floor and presented to the public. Because only then does it have a sense of urgency and white-hot heat.
The South Bank Show is back next week at 11:05.